October 29th, 2012. It's just after 8 p.m. on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and the largest Atlantic hurricane ever measured by diameter is bearing down on New York City. Its wind field stretches almost 1,000 miles from edge to edge. Its eye is no longer well defined. Meteorologists are arguing in real time about whether it is technically still a hurricane at all. None of that matters to anyone watching the harbor, because what is coming up the Hudson and into the East River right now is not really a wind problem. It is a water problem, and the water is rising faster than the seawalls were ever built to handle. By midnight, the lights in Lower Manhattan will be out. The subway tunnels that move 5 million people a day will be filling with salt water. A hospital in Bellevue will be evacuating patients down stairwells by flashlight. A neighborhood in Queens called Breezy Point will be on fire, with the fire engines unable to reach it because the streets have become rivers. And on Staten Island, a mother named Glenda Moore will be trying to hold on to her 2 small sons in the dark. What happened in New York on that single night exposed something the city had been quietly told about for at least a decade. The warnings were there. The studies were there. The maps existed. The question of what would happen if a slow, enormous storm pushed the Atlantic Ocean directly into the mouth of the harbor had been answered on paper, in detail, and largely ignored. This is the story of the storm that almost ended New York. And the reason it didn't quite finish the job has very little to do with luck and almost everything to do with the people who decided, in the worst hour of their lives, that they were going to stay where they were and help. To understand what Sandy did to New York, you first have to understand what New York actually is, geographically, beneath the skyline. Most people picture Manhattan as a tall, solid island. It is not. The 5 boroughs of New York City sit on a low, complicated coastline of estuaries, marshes, barrier beaches, and former wetlands that were filled in by hand a century ago to make room for warehouses, neighborhoods, and the financial district. Battery Park, at the southern tip of Manhattan, sits roughly 5 feet above mean sea level. Coney Island, the Rockaways, parts of Staten Island, the low neighborhoods of southern Brooklyn, they sit even lower. The whole region is essentially a series of bowls and funnels, with the New York Bight, a right-angle bend in the Atlantic coast, pointing straight up into the heart of the city like a loaded barrel. Drop the wrong storm into the wrong corner of that bight, and the ocean does not have to be pushed very hard before it floods the streets. For most of the city's history, that did not happen, because the storms that approached New York were either weakening as they came north or steered out to sea by the prevailing winds. New York had been hit. New England had been hit. The hurricane of 1938 had killed hundreds further up the coast. But a direct, slow, enormous strike on the harbor itself, the kind of storm the planners called the worst case, that had never quite arrived in living memory. It had been studied. It had been modeled. In 2009, a state commission released a 99-page report warning that New York City was extraordinarily vulnerable to coastal flooding and that climate change was making the risk worse, not better. The report estimated potential losses in the tens of billions of dollars. It did not make the front page. It was filed. A tropical wave came off the west coast of Africa on October 11, 2012. It tracked west across the Atlantic, slow and unremarkable. By October 22nd, it had organized into a tropical depression in the southern Caribbean. By October 24th, it was a hurricane, and it was named Sandy. Sandy crossed Jamaica that day as a Category 1. Less than 24 hours later, it had strengthened to Category 3 and made its second landfall in eastern Cuba, where it killed 11 people and tore through the city of Santiago. It weakened slightly as it moved north through the Bahamas, then began to do something the National Hurricane Center had been quietly afraid of for days. It started to grow. Most hurricanes are dangerous because they are intense. Sandy became dangerous because it became enormous. Its wind field expanded outward as it moved north. By October 28th, tropical storm force winds extended out to a radius of roughly 500 miles. The storm itself was no longer a tight, photogenic spiral. It was a sprawling, lopsided system being squeezed by an upper-level trough to the west and a blocking high-pressure system over Greenland to the northeast. Those two features acted like a pair of hands. Where a normal late-season hurricane would have been pushed harmlessly out into the open Atlantic, Sandy was instead bent sharply west, on a heading that brought it directly into the New Jersey coast, almost at right angles. In the forecasting world, this is called a left turn. There is no precedent for it in the modern hurricane record at that latitude. The European weather model had been predicting the maneuver for nearly a week. The American model had not. The European model was right. Meteorologists watching the satellite imagery on October 28th and 29th began using a word in their internal messages that they almost never use about a single storm. The word was unprecedented. By the morning of October 29th, Sandy was no longer a clean hurricane. It was beginning to merge with a cold front and a separate winter storm system over the eastern United States. The merger gave it characteristics of both a tropical cyclone and a nor'easter, a hybrid the press would label Superstorm. The technical debate over what to call it was, by then, almost beside the point. It was about 900 miles wide. It was crawling northwest at about 15 miles an hour. Its central pressure had fallen to 940 millibars, the lowest ever recorded north of Cape Hatteras. And it was perfectly positioned to drive the Atlantic Ocean into the New York Bight at the worst possible angle. The last detail mattered more than anything else. The angle of approach lined up almost exactly with the geometry of the bight, which meant that instead of the surge spreading out along a wide coastline, it was being funneled directly toward the mouth of New York Harbor. And the timing of landfall was about to coincide with high tide on the night of a full moon. The astronomical tides that night were going to be among the highest of the year. Add the surge on top of those tides, and the numbers stopped being numbers. They became something else entirely. The morning of October 29th in New York was strangely calm. There was rain, but not heavy. There was wind, but not yet the kind that breaks windows. The subway had stopped running the night before, by order of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Schools were closed. Mandatory evacuations had been issued for Zone A, the lowest-lying neighborhoods along the coast, including Battery Park City, the Lower East Side waterfront, Red Hook, Coney Island, the Rockaways, and large parts of Staten Island. Approximately 375,000 people lived in Zone A. Many of them left. Many of them did not. Some did not believe the storm would be worse than Irene, which had brushed the city the year before and largely spared it. Some had nowhere to go. Some were elderly and could not move easily. Some were caring for someone who couldn't. In the Rockaways, a long, thin barrier peninsula in southern Queens, residents who had been through hurricanes before boarded up their windows, filled their bathtubs, and waited. In Breezy Point, at the western tip of the peninsula, families gathered at neighbors' houses on slightly higher ground. The fire department's volunteer chief in Breezy Point would later say that what concerned him most was not the wind. It was that the entire community sat below sea level, that there was only one road in and out, and that the gas mains ran under every street. In Lower Manhattan, the operators of Consolidated Edison's East 13th Street substation watched the harbor. The substation supplied power to most of downtown. It had been built in 1926. It had a wall around it. The wall was built to a height that had been considered adequate based on the historical flood data. The historical flood data was about to become useless. At around 8 p.m. on October 29th, the center of Sandy made landfall near Brigantine, New Jersey, just northeast of Atlantic City. It was no longer technically a hurricane. The National Hurricane Center had reclassified it as a post-tropical cyclone less than 2 hours earlier, a decision that would later be criticized because it complicated the issuance of hurricane warnings in the most critical hours. What it was called was irrelevant on the ground. Its sustained winds were still around 80 miles an hour. Its pressure was historic, and the bulge of ocean that had been pushed ahead of it for hundreds of miles was now arriving at the mouth of New York Harbor at precisely the moment the tide was at its highest. At the Battery, the tide gauge that has measured the harbor's water level since the 1850s recorded a peak storm surge of 9.4 feet on top of an astronomical high tide of about 5 feet. The total water level reached 14.06 feet above mean lower low water. It was the highest level ever recorded at the Battery in the history of the gauge. The previous record had been set by a hurricane in 1960, and Sandy beat it by more than 3 feet. 3 feet does not sound like much until you remember what was at that elevation. At the Battery, the seawall was being overtopped. Salt water was pouring up the steps and into the streets of the financial district. It crossed West Street. It moved into the lobbies of office towers. It flowed east through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which had been left unsealed because the closure had been ordered late. By the early hours of October 30th, the tunnel was holding 86 million gallons of seawater. In the South Ferry subway station, water filled the entire 7-story deep complex from the platforms up to the mezzanine. A few blocks north, the wall around the East 13th Street substation gave way at almost the exact moment of the surge peak. Salt water rushed across the substation floor, reached the high-voltage equipment, and the equipment did what salt-soaked high-voltage equipment does. A blue-white fireball climbed into the sky over the East River. The sound of the explosion carried across Manhattan. The substation tripped offline, and almost everything south of 39th Street in Manhattan went dark in a single instant. From the Empire State Building south, the city that never sleeps simply switched off. From across the river in Brooklyn and New Jersey, the lower half of the most famous skyline in the world was suddenly a black void below the lights of Midtown. That moment, the moment of the substation explosion, is what most people who lived through Sandy remember first. Because it was visible from everywhere, and because for a generation that had grown up in a city that was always lit, it was the first time many of them had ever seen Manhattan dark. The water did not stop at the financial district. It moved north up the East River and pressed into the FDR Drive, into Stuyvesant Town, into the Lower East Side. Below 14th Street, on a flat block on First Avenue, sits Bellevue Hospital, the oldest public hospital in America. Bellevue's basement contained its main electrical switchgear, its fuel pumps, its food stores, and the equipment that supplied power to ventilators and critical care machines on the upper floors. The basement was not supposed to flood. The basement flooded. The fuel pumps for the rooftop generators went underwater within minutes. The generators on the roof kept running for a while on the fuel still in the pipes, but the line was finite. A few blocks away, the same thing happened at NYU Langone. The hospital lost backup power on a night when more than 200 patients were still inside, including babies in the neonatal intensive care unit. What the staff did over the next several hours has become one of the central stories of Sandy. With elevators dead, doctors, nurses, residents, and security guards formed human chains in the stairwells. Newborns were carried down from the 9th floor in arms, with portable battery packs powering their ventilators. Adult patients on stretchers were lowered story by story in the dark, 4 people to a stretcher, headlamps strapped to their foreheads. The youngest baby evacuated that night weighed less than 2 pounds. None of the patients evacuated from NYU Langone that night died as a result of the evacuation. Not one. At Bellevue, the same operation began roughly a day later, after the fuel pump failure had cascaded through the building. National Guard troops were brought in to carry buckets of diesel up 13 floors by hand to keep the remaining generators running. More than 700 patients were eventually evacuated from Bellevue. The hospital did not fully reopen for nearly 3 months. The basement, the lowest floor in one of the most critical buildings in New York City, had not been designed for what the harbor did on a single night in October. While the hospitals were being emptied, the Rockaways were burning. In Breezy Point, sometime around 11 p.m., a fire started in one house, almost certainly because salt water reached an electrical panel. The wind was still gusting. The flames jumped to the next house, and then the next. The fire department arrived and could not advance because the streets were under 4 feet of seawater and the hydrants were submerged. The closest engines, parked at higher ground, could only watch the line of houses go up. Volunteer firefighters waded in chest-deep water trying to pull people out of homes that were now simultaneously flooding and burning. By dawn, 126 houses in Breezy Point had burned to their foundations. Another 22 had been damaged by fire. Photographs taken the next morning show entire blocks reduced to chimneys, with the floodwater still standing in the streets between them. No one in Breezy Point died in the fire. That, too, was largely because of the people who refused to leave their neighbors. A mile away, on the bay side of the Rockaway Peninsula, a 24-year-old paramedic named Damian Knapp was already deep into the worst shift of his career. He had been on duty when his own house in Bell Harbor flooded. He kept working anyway. Over the course of the night and into the next day, he and his colleagues responded to call after call, wading through salt water that was knee-deep, then waist-deep, then chest-deep, ferrying elderly residents out of one-story homes that had taken on 6 feet of water. Some of the people he reached had been waiting in attics, the same way people had waited in attics during Katrina 7 years earlier. The pattern of the rescue was almost identical. So was the silence afterwards, when the water finally went down. Further south on Staten Island, the story took a different shape, because Staten Island is more spread out, with more single-family homes and more low-lying coastal neighborhoods, and because the surge from Sandy hit the island's eastern shore almost head-on. The water came in faster than people expected. In Midland Beach, in Oakwood Beach, in Newdorp Beach, residents who had ridden out hurricanes before were trapped in their living rooms by water that rose to the ceiling within minutes. 23 people died on Staten Island during Sandy. It was, by some distance, the worst-hit borough in terms of fatalities. The most often retold of those deaths happened on Father Capodanno Boulevard. Glenda Moore, a 39-year-old nurse, had been trying to drive away from the rising water with her 2 sons, Brandon, who was 4, and Connor, who was 2. Their SUV was caught by the surge. She got the boys out of the vehicle and tried to carry them through the rising water. A wave separated them from her. She made it to a nearby home and pounded on the door for help. The door was not opened. By the time she found someone willing to call 911, her sons were gone. The boys were found 2 days later in marshland a short distance from where the car had stalled. The story of that night, of the door that was not opened, of a mother in the dark holding 2 small hands against the current, is the story that more than anything else came to stand in for what Sandy did to families. It was not a wind that killed Brandon and Connor Moore. It was the water in a residential neighborhood on a street that no one had ever thought of as the coastline. By the morning of October 30th, the storm itself had moved inland and was weakening over Pennsylvania. The wind dropped, the rain dropped, the sun came up on a city that did not look like itself. Lower Manhattan was still dark. The subway was flooded in 9 separate places, including the Montague Street Tube, the Cranberry Street Tube, and the South Ferry Station. LaGuardia Airport was underwater. The cars at the bottom of Battery Park City had been picked up and stacked against each other like driftwood. In Hoboken and Jersey City across the river, the streets were filled with floating cars and rafts of debris. A construction crane on top of a luxury tower at 157 West 57th Street had partially collapsed during the storm and was hanging by its own structure, swinging over the streets below for days while engineers tried to figure out how to secure it. The scale of what had happened took weeks to come into focus. 24 of the city's 53 hospitals had lost some form of power. More than 800,000 customers in New York City had no electricity. In the Rockaways, in Coney Island, in parts of Staten Island, that outage stretched not for hours but for weeks. November in New York is cold. Some of the public housing buildings in the most affected neighborhoods had no power, no heat, and no working elevators for 2 weeks or more. The residents of those buildings, many of them elderly, many of them disabled, were left to climb stairs in the dark, in winter coats, with flashlights, to retrieve drinking water and food brought by volunteers from below. The city's response, in the formal sense, was uneven. The Federal Emergency Management Agency had pre-positioned resources before landfall. The Coast Guard, the National Guard, and the New York Police and Fire Departments performed thousands of rescues during the storm and in the days afterward. But the official recovery was slow to reach the hardest-hit neighborhoods. What filled the gap was not a federal agency. It was the city itself. A movement that came to be known as Occupy Sandy, built on the infrastructure of the Occupy Wall Street protests from the year before, set up distribution hubs in churches across Brooklyn and Queens within 48 hours of the storm. They distributed hot meals, blankets, batteries, baby formula, and medication. Sometimes they were inside flooded homes mucking out basements before the National Guard had reached the block. The full numbers, when they were finally counted, were these. In New York State, 53 people lost their lives in connection with Sandy. Across the wider region, including New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and the storm's earlier track through the Caribbean, the death toll reached at least 233 people across 8 countries. The financial damage in the United States alone reached approximately $70 billion, making Sandy the second costliest Atlantic hurricane on record at the time, surpassed only by Katrina. In New York City, more than 88,000 buildings were within the area that was actually flooded, including over 23,000 businesses. In total, around 2 million people in the metropolitan area lost power at some point. 17 subway tunnels were inundated. The South Ferry Station, only opened in 2009, was so badly damaged it had to be rebuilt almost from scratch over the next several years. A year later, the city released a long, technical, deeply uncomfortable plan called A Stronger, More Resilient New York. The report acknowledged what the 2009 Commission report had said. The city was vulnerable. It was built in places it should not have been built. The infrastructure had been designed for a climate that no longer existed. It proposed billions of dollars in new seawalls, surge barriers, hardened substations, raised electrical equipment, drainage improvements, and dune restoration along the most exposed coastlines. Some of those projects have been built. Some are still on paper. Some have been delayed by the same kind of interagency disputes that delayed the warnings before the storm. The utility companies, after Sandy, raised the electrical equipment at dozens of substations to higher elevations and rebuilt the wall around the East 13th Street substation. The subway authority installed floodgates on tunnels. The hospitals moved their generators and switchgear out of the basements. The Rockaways got a new boardwalk that doubled as a low seawall. Some homes in Staten Island were bought out by a state program and demolished. The land returned to wetlands that were always supposed to be there. Other neighborhoods rebuilt in place, sometimes on raised foundations, sometimes not. What Sandy did, in the deepest sense, was not destroy New York. The city is still here. Lower Manhattan came back. The subway came back. The hospitals reopened. The boardwalks were rebuilt. What Sandy did was something quieter and more permanent. It rewrote the city's understanding of what it was sitting on. For more than a century, New York had behaved as if the harbor was a feature it owned. Sandy demonstrated in a single night that the harbor was simply a guest in the city's living room that had agreed, until that moment, to behave politely. The geography that made New York one of the great trading ports of the world, the deep, sheltered, navigable Bight, is the same geography that, with the wrong storm, becomes a barrel pointed at the city. The climate that produces stronger, wetter, larger storms is not going back to where it was. The sea level at the Battery has risen by more than a foot since 1900 and is projected to rise by at least another 2 by the end of this century. The next Sandy will not have to be a stronger storm to do more damage. It will simply have to arrive on a tide that is 1 foot higher. For the people who lived through that night, the most lasting memories are not the numbers. They are the specific images. The blue arc over the East River when the substation went. The babies carried down dark stairwells in arms. The line of houses on fire in Breezy Point with water lapping at the doorsteps. The 2 small bodies recovered from the Staten Island marsh. The volunteer in a borrowed van pulling up to a flooded street in the Rockaways with a load of dry blankets because no one else had come yet, and the storm had made it clear that no one else might be coming for a while. New York was not ended on October 29, 2012, but it was reminded, in a way the city had managed to forget for a long time, that the line between the sea and the streets is a line the city did not draw and cannot redraw, and was never permanent in the first place. The next storm is already forming somewhere. The maps of where it will go have already been drawn. The question is not whether the warnings will be there. The warnings will be there. The question is whether anyone will believe them this time. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. These videos take weeks of research, and every small bit of support helps these stories reach more people. Tell me in the comments what you remember about that night, if you were there, or what story from Sandy you want me to tell next. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.